Hey guys, it's Nate, and welcome to another one of my YouTube videos. Today we're going to be diving into part 4 of the epoxy river desk build, where I go into how I fabricated and custom built my legs. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching. The first part in fabricating my legs was to design them. My epoxy desk had 2 layers of deep pore epoxy that didn't make it necessarily clear, but definitely translucent, so I didn't want to have any substructure of metal underneath that you could see from the top. This is why I designed 2 top plates that are separated, as it allows the epoxy section to be free from underlying structure of metal. If this is your first video of mine, welcome and thanks for stopping by. If you'd like to see the process that got me up to this point, I have those videos linked here, as well as have a playlist of this build on my channel, so go check those out if you're interested. I cut blocks of 2x4 to be placed onto my jig so that when I eventually cut the metal pieces, it could allow to be pushed right up against it and make sure that it has proper clamping surfaces, and it makes it easily reproducible to make sure that both of the legs are going to be identical. After I figured out my design, I ordered the square, rectangular, and flat stock steels that'd be used to piece together my legs. Initially, there was a problem with my first order, so I had to wait a couple days to get my corrected order. I ordered most of my stocks from onlinemetals.com, and even though they messed up my order at first, they were really good in rectifying it, and within about 3 days, I received the second shipment of my correct items. The 16 feet of rectangular stock steel came in 2 8-foot pieces, and there was a slight kink in both of my rectangular pieces at the ends, but I read about this being a potential issue when it was shipping, just because when they ship individually, there's a greater risk of them getting potentially damaged, and so I accounted for that by having, a couple inches to spare in my design, so I wasn't running out and being like within half an inch of available material. Since this was my first time welding, I wanted to try to mimic the joints that would be on the actual project, so I could practice on some scrap pieces first. So I ended up cutting the mimicked joints with some hacksaw, and because of this, there was going to be obviously human error incorporated into this, so the 2 pieces that were going to be used to make the joint weren't completely flush. To dip my hand in welding, I started off with some flat pieces of rectangular stock that were the same 2 inch by 1 inch that I was going to be using, and after about 4 beads I was getting a decent hang of it, and it was all going well until I moved on to the mimicked joint that my actual legs were going to have. This is where I immediately began to appreciate people who weld and do it for a living. The finished product of this was something that looked more like Swiss cheese than anything that resembled a weld. At that moment, I decided that I would go to a friend of mine and have them teach me on their MIG to help clean up my welds and make welding my joints feasible rather than having me ruin them with my current home setup. With that plan in mind, I started cutting my raw steel to the lengths and angles that I needed for my legs. And yes, I'm sure somebody's going to leave a comment there. Having sockets right next to my chop saw for the steel was a bad idea. I had to change the blade and didn't even give it a second thought to move them away once I started recutting stuff. I did, however, learn from my mistake, as it took quite a while to get the metal shavings out from each individual socket. Here I'm marking my square stock section that would make up the backs of my legs to get an edge that I wanted to allow it to be the joint to the bottom rectangle section. Here you can see the square stock with the edge cut to reveal the tab of the joint. I began to assemble my pieces on the wooden jig to make sure both legs were as close to identical as possible. Here's the process after the first day of cutting the pieces to shape. I still, however, had one small piece with a very large angle that my chop saw couldn't dial into, so I needed to stop and get an angle grinder blade. The next day I finished off the small piece that had a steep angulation with my angle grinding wheel. At first I was an idiot and didn't have gloves on when doing this. Bottom line, put gloves on when using your angle grinder to make sure that you're not burning yourself with sparks, but most importantly to make sure that if the blade does slip, it's hitting a glove first before just your bare hand. After I finished one of the smaller pieces, I clamped the other uncut piece to cut it to be pretty much the same and then do minor adjustments to each individually afterwards. When you are preparing for welding, you want to make sure that the edges are cleaned. So here I'm doing that with an angle grinder, just getting the first inch or so welded up so it's a nice clean steel that's being touched by the welds. After I tack welded all my pieces in place, I took the leg out of the jig to get better access to the angles that the wood was blocking, as well as prevent any fires from potentially happening from the wooden jig. You can see that I am rotating around when I'm welding. I do this to limit the amount of warping that can occur if you stay in one position too long, and because I had two legs that needed to be relatively identical, I definitely did not want this to happen. After I welded up the rectangular and square stock pieces to one another, I cut the top plates on site and then welded them to make sure they were level, because this was going to be what was actually going to be contacting the bottom side of the desk, so it had to be as flat as possible. If you guys haven't already and you like this video, please be sure to smash that like button, hit the subscribe and bell if you are interested in getting more notifications about when new content from mine comes out. And since this was my first welding project, I would gladly take some advice in how I can kind of increase my welding skills. I'd love to keep continuing to make stuff like this in the future. So if you guys have any advice for how to increase my proficiency in welding, that'd be awesome. After my welds, I do a rough cleanup with the angle grinder to get rid of any excess flash or bulk from the weld beads. The final thing that I'm going to be adding to this desk is going to be a keyboard tray for my 88 key keyboard to use for some music production. And initially, when I was going to think about how to mount that to my legs, I was going to use some angled aluminum that was going to be bolted to the top plate in order to stabilize it. However, after thinking about it, I decided that the legs would look a lot cleaner with just an extra set of plates mounted perpendicularly to the top plate, which would be used to anchor the keyboard tray. I cut the new plates so they would be fit flush between the upper structure of the legs. From there, I started laying out the hole placements for the tops and side plates. The new non-welded plates were much easier to drill because I could use the drill press instead of a cordless, and the drill press made a short work of them compared to the powered hand drill. After getting them to the size that I wanted, I tested the size of the bolts that I'd be using to what would finally be used. Here is a 1/4-20 bolt, but I would be using a furniture bolt leg for the final design to secure the legs to the desktop. The feet on the table were going to be leveling screw feet, so I needed a little extra material on the bottom to tap where the feet were going to be. I pre-drilled these circular pieces prior to welding to make it easier for me to use the power drill to bore them out to the bigger size before I tap them. Here's some of the coolest footage that I got of the legs being welded. And here was by far the best weld of the whole project. The feet washers were a little bit tricky to weld, but I rigged up a couple clamps, tacked them, and finished welding them as I let the legs sit on the floor so that I can get better access to those washers. I took it back to my house and did some finish grinding to get the joints looking nice and clean. I completed the final boring of the bottom holes to get the feet tapped. Unfortunately, I broke a bit off and had to off-center one of the holes since I couldn't get the bit out and no other drill would touch it. You wouldn't ever see the difference, but it's just something that I'll just have to live with. Like, I'll know, but nobody else will probably ever figure that out. Once I tapped the bottom feet, I did a quick test to make sure that my screwed on feet would fit correctly. Once all this was finished, I sent the legs over to be sandblasted and powder coated, and here's how they turned out. I think the matte black looks absolutely phenomenal on these legs. I'm not going to actually mount them just yet because I want to first design and finish up the keyboard tray and mount them onto the legs. That way it's going to fit perfectly before actually mounting it onto the tabletop. I'd rather have that fit totally correctly with the keyboard and then mount it than do the vice versa and have to, fit the keyboard tray into something that's already rigidly in place. If you got to this end of the video, thanks guys for watching. If you liked what you saw, make sure to smash that like button. It takes 0.2 seconds, so that would be awesome if you could help my channel that way. So thanks guys for stopping by, and I look forward to seeing you in another one of my videos on the build. All right, cool. Thanks guys. Peace.